The ocean stretched endlessly across the Pacific, calm on the surface, but beneath its shimmering skin, shadows moved. The year was 1943 and Japan's empire ruled the seas. But as the tide of war began to turn, the Imperial Navy turned to desperate measures, searching not only for weapons, but for intelligence hidden in nature itself. In a secluded base along the coast of Shikoku, a small team of naval scientists gathered at dawn. The air smelled of salt and oil, and behind closed steel doors, tanks of seawater shimmered under flickering lights. Inside, sleek gray forms cut through the water, dolphins captured from the southern seas and brought here under strict secrecy. The officers called it Project Omigami, the ocean gods. At first, the men laughed at the idea. Dolphins trained like soldiers? It sounded like madness. But the commander, a man of science and faith, saw something in their eyes: intelligence, precision, loyalty. He believed that with discipline and pain, even the ocean could be weaponized. The training began with simple tasks: fetching metal rings, following boats, signaling with their fins. But as weeks passed, the drills grew darker. The dolphins were fitted with harnesses of steel and explosives, and the men watched, silent, as they were forced to approach mock submarines. Every success meant another step closer to turning life into a weapon. Rumors spread through the fleet, stories of dolphins that could find submarines in pitch darkness, of whales that followed enemy convoys, of sea lions used to retrieve mines. No one knew what was true. But across the islands, whispers of Japan's ocean soldiers began to reach Allied intelligence. By late 1944, the war had shifted. The Allies were pushing closer, island by island. Japan's hope lay in desperation, and the sea was their last ally. In the deep waters near Okinawa, experiments intensified. Dolphins were released into the dark, each carrying a small metallic payload beneath their bellies. The goal was simple: find the enemy, strike unseen. But the ocean has no masters. Many of the dolphins never returned. Some swam too far, disoriented by sonar and the thunder of distant bombs. Others returned to the shore, their harnesses gone, their eyes clouded with confusion. The soldiers began to believe the animals understood too much, that they had chosen not to obey. At night, the handlers sat by the tanks, listening to the strange, mournful cries that echoed through the corridors. It was said that one dolphin, a female named Mitsu, refused to eat after her podmates vanished. She hovered near the surface, watching the men with unblinking eyes, as if she understood what they had done. The scientist who cared for her broke regulations, releasing her into the sea one moonless night. He was never seen again. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, the facility lay in ruin. Allied forces discovered fragments of research logs, sketches of harnesses, and photographs of dolphins swimming in formation beside torpedo boats. Most of the documents were burned before they arrived. The ocean had swallowed the evidence. Years later, fishermen along the coast of Shikoku began telling stories. Strange encounters with dolphins that followed their boats silently, keeping their distance, never playful, always watching. Their scars gleamed under the water, circular marks along their fins, remnants of straps long gone. They said these were not ordinary dolphins. They were the ghosts of war. Scientists dismissed the tales as superstition. But divers who ventured into the deep trenches sometimes reported eerie sounds: mechanical clicks that didn't match known species, echoes that seemed to mimic the sonar of machines. Some believed the descendants of those trained dolphins still remembered, their instincts twisted by a war that ended long before they were born. In the decades that followed, Japan's oceans recovered. The ports grew silent, then busy again with trade and tourism. But beneath the waves, something ancient remained, a legacy not written in books but carried in bloodlines and memories. The sea, vast and merciless, had kept its secrets. Today, the story of Project Omigami remains hidden between myth and classified history. The few surviving documents mention marine intelligence experiments, nothing more. Yet divers still whisper about encounters with dolphins that seem too focused, too deliberate, as if trained for something more than nature intended. The Pacific holds its ghosts well. And sometimes, when the sun sinks over the Japanese coast and the water turns crimson, a shadow breaks the surface, a fin gliding toward the horizon, disappearing into the same endless deep that once turned life itself into a weapon. Snow fell silently over the ruins of Stalingrad. Smoke still lingered in the air, thick and bitter, curling from what remained of burnt steel and shattered bones. The world had turned gray, sky, ground, faces, everything swallowed by the endless winter of war. Men stood with rifles clutched to their chests, their eyes hollow, frost biting through their torn gloves. Hunger gnawed at their ribs. Fear lived in their breath. But somewhere behind those frozen lines, deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, another kind of soldier was being prepared, not born of command or ideology but of desperation. They were dogs. Not pets. Not mascots. Soldiers, trained, conditioned, and turned into living weapons. Each had been raised with one purpose: to destroy enemy tanks. Trainers worked in secret bases near Moscow, surrounded by the distant echoes of artillery. They starved the dogs for days, then fed them only beneath the belly of idling Soviet tanks, so they would associate the smell of oil, metal, and gasoline with food. When the time came, each was strapped with explosives on their back, a wooden lever jutting upward like a broken antenna. Their mission was simple and unthinkable: run beneath enemy armor and pull the trigger with their own bodies. By 1942, the German Panzers had rolled across the plains of Russia, unstoppable and unrelenting. Soviet soldiers watched as the steel beasts chewed through everything: men, bunkers, entire villages. The front lines began to crumble. And so the command was given: release the dogs. They came running out of the trenches like shadows, lean, silent, determined. The Germans laughed at first, thinking they were strays. But within seconds the laughter vanished. A single blast shattered the calm. A tank erupted in fire, its crew scrambling out, burning. Then another explosion, and another. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. The Soviets had unleashed their final weapon. Stories spread quickly across the front. Entire German divisions began to fear the ground itself, believing it moved with hidden explosives. Tank crews refused to stop their engines, terrified that any pause might bring death from below. The soldiers called them Hollenhund, hell dogs. But for every success there were horrors too heavy to tell. Some dogs, confused by the roar of battle, turned back toward the trenches that had raised them, returning to their handlers with live bombs still ticking. Others froze in terror, lost amid explosions, their instinct for loyalty stronger than their training. The Soviets buried those failures in silence, refusing to acknowledge the tragedy behind the tactic. Still, the program continued. Thousands of dogs were sent to the front. German shepherds, mutts, strays from broken homes. Each one carried a number, not a name. Each one trained to die for a war they could never understand. As the war dragged on, the image of the Soviet dog became a symbol, both feared and revered. Propaganda posters painted them as heroes. Soldiers whispered prayers for them at night. There were even tales of dogs that returned from missions alive, wounded, limping through fire to find their way back home. One such dog, known only as Dina, was said to have survived 3 missions. Her handler swore she could sense the enemy before they appeared. She ran through the snow without hesitation, vanishing beneath a German panzer and leaving behind nothing but a blinding flash. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to turn. The Germans were retreating, the Red Army advancing westward, the fields littered with steel and ash. But in the silence that followed victory, the Soviet government erased most traces of the dog battalions. The official reports described them as successful tactical experiments. The truth was buried beneath medals and propaganda. The survivors, the few dogs that lived long enough to see peace, were left wandering the ruined villages they had fought to protect. No handlers, no orders, just ghosts with fur and scars. Some were taken in by soldiers who could not bear to let them die alone. Others simply disappeared into the forests, where no gunfire echoed, and the only sound was the wind through broken trees. Years later, veterans would speak of them in hushed tones. They said they could still hear the dogs' footsteps in the snow, the faint panting carried by the wind before a battle. In their dreams they saw them still running, not toward death but toward home. And though their story was buried under decades of silence, the legend of the dogs that fought tanks endured. They were not heroes by choice. They were not soldiers by will. But in the darkest winter of human history they became something else. A symbol of the madness of war and the loyalty that even fear could not destroy. Even now, when snow falls on the old battlefields of the East, it is said you can see paw prints that lead nowhere, fading but never gone. As the snow melted and the fields of Europe turned green again, the world tried to forget. The tanks were gone, the banners burned, and the parades filled the streets with victory songs. But the war's true survivors were not always the ones celebrated. In quiet corners of the Soviet countryside, a few handlers returned to the kennels where it all began. The cages were empty now, only rusted chains and claw marks remained. One man, his hair turned gray from both age and grief, knelt by an old feeding bowl still marked with a name scratched into the metal: Alma. He whispered to the wind as though she might return. Around him, wild dogs roamed the ruins, their eyes sharp but distant, carrying the bloodline of those who once ran toward fire. The Soviet command never spoke of them again. The archives were sealed, the documents stamped classified. In official history, their existence became a rumor, whispered by veterans, denied by officials, forgotten by time. Yet, in the hearts of those who saw them run through the snow, they remained eternal. When the Iron Curtain finally fell decades later, journalists uncovered fragments of their story, photographs of handlers beside loyal companions, faded notes detailing missions, medals awarded to units that never spoke of what they had done. The truth was horrifying and beautiful. Even in humanity's darkest war, these animals had shown a kind of devotion that no human order could command. In modern Russia, a small memorial stands near an old training field outside Moscow. It is simple, just a bronze statue of a dog staring forward, poised mid-step as if ready to run again. The plaque beneath it reads, "To the faithful ones." They had no choice, but they never hesitated. Every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, flowers appear at its base. Some are left by soldiers' families, others by strangers who only know the story from fragments. They come to honor not just the dogs, but what they represented: loyalty without question, courage without glory, and sacrifice without recognition. And as dusk falls over the monument, the wind carries a faint echo, boots crunching snow, distant thunder, and somewhere in the fading light, the soft rhythm of paws running through memory. History moves on, but legends never die. Somewhere beyond the ruins of war, beyond smoke and silence, the dogs still run. They are free now, no bombs, no fear, no commands, just the endless horizon, the open steppe, and peace at last.